The Vikings discovered the New World, far before Christopher Columbus did, almost 500 years before to be exact. The Vikings, also known as the Norsemen, settled in Greenland in the year 980. This is because Erik the Red was banished from Iceland for manslaughter. He left Iceland to explore Greenland during his banishment. Erik the Red coaxed other Vikings into settling in Greenland, and eventually 2 main settlements were made at the southern tip, with around 2,000 to 3,000 settlers. From there, the Vikings, led by Erik's son, Ericsson, traveled south past Baffin Island to Newfoundland and possibly beyond. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Vikings began to trade with the First Nations peoples, but somewhere along the way, the Viking colonies in North America began to decline and were eventually abandoned by the year 1377. The Vikings were incredibly hostile toward the indigenous Americans, and they even called them Skraelings, which roughly translates to wretched people. The Vikings treated the natives very poorly, so in retaliation, the natives forced the Norsemen to leave and eventually make their way back to Iceland. But what if the Vikings did not treat the Native Americans poorly, and they weren't forced to leave? In short, what if the Vikings had stayed in North America? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. I'm Charlotte Dobre. Unlike Christopher Columbus, who actually thought he arrived in India when he found the New World, Ericsson knew where he was going. He heard of a strange land to the west from an Icelandic trader who sailed past North America a decade earlier without setting foot on it. Ericsson sailed to what is now Canada, but at the time, they called it Vineland. But Viking settlers remained in Greenland, likely because of the violent encounters they had in North America. This included the slaying of Ericsson's brother Thorwald by the indigenous peoples. So if this hostility did not occur and the Vikings stayed in North America, how would that have affected North America or even the world as we know it today? One of the major ways a Viking settlement would have changed the course of history is that the Norsemen would have inevitably mated with the native population. There were some marriages between Vikings and Aboriginals, but if the Vikings had not been kicked out, we would have seen far more mixed race groups, like that of the Métis. The Métis are mixed race Aboriginals. They developed as the mixed race descendants of unions between the First Nations women and Western European men. One is to assume that if the Norsemen and First Nations began to intermingle, we would see a lot more mixed race descendants today. The rich cultures and traditions of both would also become mixed. The Vikings could have taught the First Nations how to make iron tools, as well as sophisticated farming techniques. The Vikings had also begun converting to Christianity by the time they were in Vineland, and with Christianity came writing. If the Vikings and indigenous peoples were able to coexist in the New World, they would have taught the First Nations to read and write, far before the Europeans did. The languages of the two cultures also would have become mixed. We saw this happen in South Africa with Afrikaans. If enough Europeans heard about the New World and came over to North America from Norway and Iceland, perhaps Newfoundland would have a distinctly Viking heritage today. Word about the New World would have spread in Europe sooner, and inevitably, voyages to the New World would have occurred sooner, maybe even far before Columbus made his cross of the Atlantic. Vikings would have also explored the rest of the North American Atlantic coastline and made their way south, maybe even as far south as Central America. Another way the world would be different today if the Vikings had stayed in North America is that the Vikings would have brought smallpox to the indigenous peoples far sooner than when the Europeans did. Because Native Americans did not have any prior contact with Europeans and hadn't been exposed to their diseases, smallpox killed off indigenous peoples by the millions. If the Vikings continued to move to the New World, inevitably individuals with smallpox would have also. But if the native population was infected with smallpox sooner, that means that the native population would have had time to recover and develop a better immunity to smallpox. Native Americans by then would have known how to avoid smallpox in the first place. It is customary for First Nation peoples to visit the sick, which inevitably led to the spread of the disease. If the Aboriginals already knew about smallpox and other diseases, they would have been more rehearsed on how to avoid getting sick in the first place. What do you think would have happened if the Vikings had stayed in North America? Write your responses in the comments below, as well as any topics you'd like to see next. For now, I'm Charlotte Dobre. This is Life's Biggest Questions. Don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more answers.